Hi everyone, this is Chelsea Cars speaking from the Ontario Trillium Foundation. I'm just here to introduce the Ontario Trillium Foundation's role in this webinar today. So a little brief background on OTF. We are an agency of the Government of Ontario, and we actually are one of the leading granting foundations in all of Canada. Our budget is over $136 million, and we award something like 1,000 projects every year. We are also a leading public agency and partner in the public benefit sector. The Ontario Trillium Foundation's mandate is to build healthy and vibrant communities. To do this, we've developed a granting strategy that's based on 6 action areas. These action areas are shown here on the slide. They are active people, whose goal is to foster more active lifestyles; connected people, which is geared towards building inclusive and engaged communities; green people, which is all about encouraging people to support healthy and sustainable environment; inspired people, which is to help enrich people's lives through arts, culture, and heritage; promising young people, which is about supporting the positive development of children and youth; and finally, prosperous people, which is about enhancing people's economic well-being.
Okay, well, thank you, Chelsea. It's also my pleasure to introduce your webinar speaker for today, Liz Weaver. Liz is the co-CEO of Tamarack Institute, where she is leading the Tamarack Learning Center. The Tamarack Learning Center has a focus on advancing community change efforts and does this by focusing on 5 strategic areas, including collective impact, collaborative leadership, community engagement, community innovation, and evaluating community impact. Liz is well known for her thought leadership on collective impact and is the author of several popular and academic papers on the topic. She is a co-catalyst partner with the Collective Impact Forum and leads a collective impact capacity building strategy with the Ontario Trillium Foundation. Welcome, Liz, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks, Duncan, and thanks, Chelsea, for orienting us to both the website and to the Ontario Trillium Foundation. We're really happy to have everybody on the call today. So this is what we're going to do today on this call. It really is about thinking about how we define a problem when we're working to get to transformational change. And so we want to help you explore how to define and scope the problem. We have a couple of tools at the end of the session, which will help assist in building consensus around the problem and help you really bring your collaboratives all to the same page, almost creating this kind of common intent around the problem. And then we have an opportunity, as Duncan said, for dialogue on your questions and maybe even some insights that you might have on some of the ways that you've built consensus around problem identification and problem solving. If we could go to the next slide, Pooja. So we want you throughout this webinar to use the text box and to really help identify some of the questions that you're bringing about problem identification. Just type them into the text box if you have that facility available to you, and at the end we'll answer your questions. But some of you might have come to the webinar with some questions already in play. If we move to the next slide, we're going to begin this webinar with a poll. And so here's the poll, and this is what we are wanting to find out about from all of you who are listeners to the webinar. The question is, what is your biggest challenge in identifying the problem or issue that you want to address collaboratively? We've got 6 options that you can choose from. And so here's the poll. If you could begin to just pick one of the options, that would be great. So is it determining the geographic scope of your work, that the issue is complex and you don't know where to start, decide how to frame the issue, articulating a systems change focus, or engaging a broad range and diverse number of community partners? If you could pick one, that would be great. We'll leave it up for maybe another 30 seconds. Okay, Pooja, if you could close the poll and let us know about the results, that would be really helpful. Thanks, Pooja. So we can see from the results that the issue is complex and you don't know really where to start, and engaging a broad range and diversity of community partners are the 2 top challenges that you face in really around problem identification, problem defining. And so we're going to deal with these during the course of this webinar. We're also going to talk a little bit about framing and the systems change focus. So, you know, this is a really important part of what we're going to learn today, is to really think about, you know, not programmatic change. It's really about transformative community change and what you can do collaboratively to get to that transformation. So thanks very much, Pooja. And if we could go on to the next slide, that would be wonderful. So now we're going to dive into the content of the webinar, and this is really about understanding community problems. And the next couple of slides bring you some resources from the community toolbox from the University of Kansas. And, you know, one of the things that we know is that communities, just like all of us, when we're thinking about our individual lives, they have problems that they need to solve as well. And so community problems, what we know about them is that they're often difficult to clearly analyze, and they're also very difficult to solve because each of us working in our individual organization sees a part of the problem, but we don't necessarily see the whole of the problem. And so bringing folks around a collaborative table is very helpful because it begins to help us see the whole of the problem. Next slide. So community problem solving really does begin with this notion of collective sense making, right? And so it's about the collective seeing, it might be about the collective learning. So collective seeing is bringing multiple eyes to the problem. Collective learning is that kind of insight. So you're doing this, I'm doing this, you're doing this, and here's the gap that we have in our community, or here's the opportunity in which we can move. And then collective framing is a really important part of problem identification because, you know, you might look at the problem from a certain lens, depending on the sector that you work in, but other people might look at the problem from a different lens. We learned this a lot in some of the work that we did at Tamarack around poverty reduction. So people in the voluntary sector look at the issue of poverty, which we know is a complex problem, from a certain lens, whereas the business community might look at it from a different lens, government might look at it from a different lens, and then people with the lived experience look at it from a different lens. And these three things, the seeing, the learning, the framing, actually allow us to build this kind of collective force for change and then this collective impact on the problem. Next slide, please. So here's some criteria for defining a community problem. Again, this comes from the University of Kansas. It's a great resource, and we would suggest you Google it, and maybe someone can put it into the text box. But we'll also send you a link in the post-webinar email to this community toolbox. But defining a community problem, you should be looking at frequency. How often does that problem occur? Is it short-term? Is it something that occurs randomly, or is it long-term and systemic? What's the duration of the problem? So how long has the problem been going on? And is that duration shifting in any way? So we might look at high school graduation rates, for example, and then all of a sudden we see this big increase in the number of people that aren't graduating from high school. Or we're seeing that, you know, the rate of people not graduating from high school is not shifting over time, which then calls us to bring forward a new kind of intervention. What's the scope and range of the problem? Does it affect a lot of people in our community or a certain subpopulation that we really want to focus on? What's the severity of the problem? How intense is the impact? Equity, does it deprive certain populations in our community? Does it impact them more than other populations? And do we need then a targeted approach at certain subpopulations? And then finally, there's this really important question about perception. Sometimes when we're working in the not-for-profit sector, we might think a problem has like it's so intense that we really need to kind of drive a solution forward. But others in the community might not share that same perception. And so that's really important. It's not only what is our perception of the problem, but how is this issue, how is this problem identified, or what does the general public or other sectors think about this problem? Next slide. So why should we analyze this? Why do we take the time to kind of spend a bit of time looking at the problem, doing a bit of the scoping and scaling? It really does help us kind of understand not only the problem that we want to tackle, but maybe some of its interrelated root causes, and that's really the heart of the problem. It also allows us to break barriers and build the case that if we were to need resources to solve the problem, there might be a case that we could build around that. And it also helps us really understand the best action plan. Next slide. So there are 9 steps that the University of Kansas in this community toolbox really suggests that we follow. And really it's about why are we choosing this problem? And so what are some criteria around the scope and you know, the impact of it and the population and the subpopulation? We also should name the problem without blaming or implying a solution. And this is really challenging often when we're dealing with very complex problems, right? Because you know, if we think about the issue of homelessness, for example, we might blame it on, you know, certain kind of interventions or certain things that have happened in the community. And really, you want to be agnostic. You want to acknowledge that this is the problem with homelessness in our community, and then how do we address that problem? You need to identify whose behavior and what factors need to change for the problem to begin to be solved. And this is really about how the community might work differently together. Also, you know, should we be getting at programmatic solutions and or systems barrier solutions? Analyze the root causes of the problem, ask why all the time. And there's a great tool in the systems change toolbox that says you should be asking why at least 5 times. So if we look at high school graduation rates, why are kids not graduating from high school? And we might say, well, they're not graduating from high school because, you know, they don't have any incentives to learn. Well, why don't they have any incentives to learn? And you keep asking that over and over again to get to the root cause of the problem, but you would do that as a group. Identify the driving forces affecting the problem and also some of the restraining. Why can't we get to solution on these kind of complex community issues? Look at the relationship between the problem that you want to focus on and other complex problems in the community. So for example, if you want to focus on poverty, you also want to look at what is happening in the community from an economic development or an economic prosperity perspective. So you want to look at both sides of the coin. If you're looking at the issue of homelessness, what's happening in the community in terms of the housing market, the rental market, because that's kind of the flip side. Is the community growing or shrinking? Is that impacting homelessness? So really looking at it not only from a small lens on the problem, but a broader lens in terms of the state of the community. Identify some personal factors like beliefs and skills and culture that may contribute to the problem. Identify some of the environmental factors, that's really availability of services, or even accessibility to the set of services in your community, and then look across your community at possible change agents. And these 9 steps in terms of analyzing your problem really kind of unpack the complexity, allow you to do a little bit of sense making and building the case around the problem, and then actually help you to kind of get sense seeking and then help get you to the sense making. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we've learned at Tamarack in terms of some of our work is this notion of framing and reframing. And we talked about this a little bit earlier, but frames are the mental structure, they're the mental models that really shape the way that we view the world. And one of the things that's really important when we're dealing with transformational change is to bring lots of different mental models to bear so that we can really understand the complexity of the model. And so this is a quote from George Lakoff, who really says, you know, and we've all seen that kind of bigger picture where they have multiple people, you know, reaching out and touching different parts of the elephant, and they're all blindfolded and they all feel something quite different. And so it's this framing and reframing that gets us to this shared sense making. Next slide. So reframing is to reframe either or debates as yes and debates. And I was at a session just recently where they were talking about community well-being, and they said, well, you know, do we only focus on 3 priorities, or do we look at all the collaboratives in our community and leverage theirs? So it wasn't a either or question. It was, yes, let's focus on some priorities, but let's also engage the other collaboratives so that we can move our whole community forward from a well-being perspective. And the task then becomes finding solutions that reconcile both sides. And this is really called reconciling the dilemma. And it really kind of talks about the horns of the dilemma. Next slide, please. So wicked questions are questions that really help us reconcile the dilemmas. And so wicked questions are ones that really don't have an obvious answer, and they actually contain embedded assumptions that we hold about the situation, issue, or problem that we're trying to solve. They, within the wicked question, contain a tension. So, you know, the answer is not immediately obvious. And so a question might be, how do we deal with this issue of poverty and also build a vibrant economy, right? And sometimes those are seen to be an either or question, but in fact, you want to work on both sides of that question. And so wicked questions are best posed as paradoxes. They're the two ends of the question seem on the surface to be paradoxical to each other, but in fact, we should be, in order to get to transformational change, we should be working on both sides of the paradox. Next slide. So working with the horns of the dilemma, here are some tips to really think about. Think about each horn as not being an either or horn, but each could have a really positive outcome for our community. So it's a good versus a good. And that resolution really comes from digging deeper on both sides of the horn. So looking at what are the strategies that we need to deal with this issue of poverty in our community, but what also are the strategies that we need to build a vibrant economy. And then you can start to say, well, to deal with poverty, we actually need to find entry-level jobs. And a good set of entry-level jobs in a community is actually part of building a vibrant economy, because we need stratification of jobs, right? We need entry-level jobs, we need mid-management jobs, we need executive-level jobs. And so, in fact, it's not a dilemma, it actually is getting to both sides of a conversation. Next slide, please. So an example of a wicked question, here's another example of a wicked question for you. So one part of it is that we're going to work on Ontario's agricultural sector so that it's supported and viable. And the other side is that we're also going to look at biodiversity conservation and recovery. And so that might seem to be that those two things are working against each other, but we want to find our pathway through both of them. And so when you're looking at transformational change and really looking at defining a problem, you want to look at both the challenge that the problem identifies, but also some of those, opportunities that come with it as well. And so really try to frame how you talk about problems from a wicked question perspective or from a horns of dilemma perspective. Next slide, please. The Forum for Youth Investment, which is an organization based out of the United States and works around youth and youth engagement across the United States, actually has dealt with this wicked problem from the perspective of youth. And so often when we're working in the frame of youth, we actually work at their problems, right? And the Forum for Youth Investment says that if we only focus on the problems embedded in youth, what we're not actually doing is working to get these youth fully prepared. So it becomes like a horns of the dilemma approach. And so you can see it in this slide, how they're looking at this. Next slide. So they say, in terms of their framing, let's really focus on youth. Yes, they have problems, but let's focus it on a way that, yes, we're going to address the problems, but we're also going to work for youth so that they become academically and vocationally productive, that they're socially and civically connected, that they're physically and emotionally healthy and safe. And what they've seen in their work is that only 4 in 10 young people are doing well across these 3 areas. And so it's not only the problem youth, there might be other youth across the sector, you know, from all different levels that might be doing okay academically, but physically and emotionally are not healthy and safe. And so they're really looking at this, you know, let's get less focused on just problems, but also focused on really getting youth ready and engaged. Next slide. And that really is the power of framing. This is a quote that actually Albert Einstein had, and it's, you know, interesting that this wisdom has been long held wisdom, right? That we can't solve the problems of today with the same thinking that has created them. And that really forces us into, when we're thinking about these complex problems, to position them as wicked questions, to look at the 2 sides of the horns of dilemma, to really start to spend time, as the University of Kansas in the Community Toolbox suggests, to really spend time scoping and scaling. So next slide. So there are different types of problems, degrees of change, and thinking implications. Pooja, if you can just keep, if you can bring this whole slide up. So those of you that have participated in Tamarack webinars before, you can see that we have talked about these 3 types of problems that our communities face. There are simple problems where we know the answer and they're fairly recipe, and if we follow them with some minor tweaks and adjustments, we will get incremental change. There are also complicated problems in our community, which really all we need is a technical team of experts to really solve the problem, so the right team can solve them. They're knowable, but we need specialized interventions, and we can get to reform change. What we're really talking about in transformative change is this notion of complex problems, right? And complex problems are that we don't necessarily fully know the answer, and it's only really bringing around a new set of people with different perspectives, with different ways of collectively seeing the problem and collectively framing the problem, that we can really move the problem forward. And this is about reinvention, creating something new, etc. Next slide. Oh, there's one more part of this one. So you can see there's an event orientation in the simple, there's critical systems and logical thinking in the complicated, but really in the complex, which is what we're talking about from the lens of transformative change, it's really about being creative. It's about disrupting the systems that we have in place and really thinking, you know, not necessarily completely outside of the box, but really spending time in the problem identification, doing solid work there, and in the framing of the problem. Next slide, Pooja. So the other thing that we've learned at Tamarack is that it is important to frame the issue, not necessarily only from a problem perspective, but maybe reframe it as a community aspiration, right? And community aspirations are really focused on the values that we hold as a community. One of the really interesting community aspirations that we've learned about is in Hamilton, when the Hamilton Roundtable was working on poverty reduction, they framed their community aspiration as making Hamilton the best place to raise a child. Now, they knew that if they were working on poverty, they weren't necessarily the best place to raise a child, but by reframing their approach under that kind of an aspiration, what they were able to do was create this big tent under which a wide range of participants could either think about participating or could agree that, yes, this is important. We don't want to see any children fall behind in our community, because if children fall behind when they graduate from high school or aren't able to get into college or university, or you know, upstream, we're going to see that they're not going to be able to be employable or get good paying jobs in our community. So by framing it, we were able to create, the Hamilton Roundtable was able to create a bigger tent. Next slide. So now we're going to pivot a little bit, and we're going to give you a couple of really practical tools that you can use for identifying your problem and issue. And each of these webinars is focused on two or three tools that we think will be very helpful to you. So if we move on to the next slide, Pooja. The first tool is really a tool that can help you scope your work. And so if you remember earlier on in the slide, we looked at that University of Kansas Community Toolbox. This tool actually is a tool where you can work as a group or around a collaborative table. You might invite the participants that you have in the group to use Post-it notes to identify the things or the perspectives that they bring to really discuss about how do we scope what we want to do? What are the elements that we want to put into our scope? And then what are some of those elements that we will have outside of our scope? And so one of the areas that you might want clarity on is are there a certain set of beneficiaries that we want to focus on, a population or a subpopulation, or are there specific targets that we want to also focus on? And this is where data really comes into play, right? You've got to know, who is being impacted by that problem in the community, and to what degree are they being impacted? So are the numbers, do the numbers reveal a growing trend, or are the numbers kind of stagnant over time? And so, but there are certain subpopulations that are more impacted, whether they're new Canadians or people from Indigenous communities or people living in low-income neighborhoods or certain sub-neighborhoods. So the kind of, or are they children, are they seniors? So the beneficiaries and targets are really important part of the scoping. The geography is a critical part of the scoping. Sometimes we might want to work at a city scale, but as we begin to look at the demographics, we see that certain neighborhoods are more impacted than other neighborhoods. And so we might prototype, while we want to work at the city scale, we might prototype certain interventions in certain neighborhoods that are more heavily impacted. We might have a timeline associated with it. So our timeline might say, we want to get this done in 1 year, in 3 years, in 5 years, what's in and what's out. And then looking at the activities and outcomes. What do we want to achieve within that timeline? What are some of the subset of activities? So in the first year, we might really focus on getting broad community buy-in and narrowing the issue and the problem. The second year, we might begin to look at behavioral change for the subpopulation, the individuals involved, and then the fifth year, we might look at population level change. Again, getting your group to use this tool collectively really gets buy-in into really thinking about, what's in and what's out of the scope of your work and the scope of the problem. Next slide. So problem identification is really a critical step in building a common agenda. So it really does allow you to define the challenge to be addressed. It acknowledges in some cases and for some groups that they want to use a collective impact framework. Maybe not all groups will, right? But it is an approach or a collective approach that is required. It establishes these kind of clear and shared goals for change, particularly if we're using data and evidence to inform our scope of work and our scope of problem, our scoping out of our problem. And then, one of the things that we haven't mentioned, but is a really critical piece of building this kind of shared and common agenda, is what are the principles that we are going to put into place around how we're going to work together. Are we going to use consensus? Are we going to use consent? Or are we going to use some other decision-making processes? Are we working at systemic change or programmatic change? So those things kind of frame the values and principles in terms of how that should guide your joint work. Next slide. So here are some other things that you can use in terms of some of the scoping. And this is all part of that first tool. It's really looking at, what do we have in our community, resources that we have that we can either leverage to move forward or that we have to build in terms of some of our pre-problem solving readiness. And so the pressing issue we've been talking about, and that's really problem identification. Data we've also spoken to. Context we've spoken to in terms of, some of that early work that the University of Kansas has suggested. Core groups. do we have around our collaborative table, our systems change table, do we have the right players? And if we don't, who are the other players that we need to have engaged in the core group? Particularly, we could start off with a subset of players and then say, oh, we're working on high school graduation. We've got the school boards, we've got students, we've got lots of the voluntary sector agencies, but we don't have parents around the table. So we need to bring their perspective to the work that we're doing. So who needs to be in the core group? Who do we not need in our core group? Often these complex problems are convened by a particular organization or co-convened by a variety of organizations. So who's doing that, and are they trusted? And do they have a commitment to this work, this collaborative effort over the longer term? And then also, how do we engage the broader community? Because we know that with complex problems, it's one thing to identify the problem, but then, the second step is to leverage the resources of the community to truly tackle the problem. And so as we begin to scope out the identification, we're uncovering some of those resources, and then we want to figure out how to engage those resources. Next slide. This problem identification tool, this is, you will get this as a tool. It's a common agenda framework. And so we really like it at Tamarack. It comes from the Kellogg Foundation, and it really helps collaborative groups, once they've gotten to the point where they understand some data around the problem and they've done a little bit of the scoping, they can use this to go a little bit deeper. And so, you can work your way around the grid. What's really interesting about this approach are the two boxes which really look at assumptions. So what are the assumptions that we hold about this issue? If we're dealing with high school graduation, our assumption might be that there's jobs out there for everybody who graduates from high school. And then when we did a scan of the community, there might not be jobs. And so, or there might be a lot of jobs. And so people are saying, well, I don't have to graduate from high school because I can go right into this well-paying job. And so you want to kind of test your assumptions. And then influential factors is another really interesting box because it starts to help unpack what's going on. So we know, for example, in the province of Ontario, that we're going into both a municipal election this year and a provincial election. For many of us, as we're thinking about scoping problems or scoping common work, these two factors are going to have some influence on us. So you want to track those influential factors as well, particularly when they're related to the particular problem, issue, or opportunity that you have available to you. Next slide, Pooja. So that gives you a really good sense of kind of setting out the problem, identifying the problem, some of that kind of upfront work. One of the things that I would say before we open it up to your questions is really to say, even though, it feels like, oh, this is hard and, challenging work, the more due diligence that we do up front, the more engaging that we are with different folks around problem identification and problem scoping, the better situated we will be over the longer term to truly solve that problem. And so it is really important to identify the problem, to figure out whether you have it framed correctly, to do the good work around scoping, what's in, what's out, and then that will help you identify strategies and to build engagement around those strategies. Because in fact, what you've done is you've built engagement right from the very get-go. So now I'm going to turn it over to Pooja and ask you, Pooja or Duncan, are there any questions that people have put into the chat box?
Hi, Liz. We have a question from John. Does this work for communities of different sizes from very small to very large?
Absolutely. I would say that it would work for all sorts of communities. I think probably if you're working on a very small community scale, it might be a little bit more challenging to get deep data analysis, right? particularly if you're working at like a sub-population level, like at a neighborhood or that kind of thing. But if I were working at a small community scale, what I would do is I would reach out to people like our municipal government or others in the community that are collecting data to find out what data they're collecting and what data they might be willing to share. So I wouldn't feel the burden of having to recreate data. I would actually look across our community, and you might have actually, you know, stronger ties to those individuals across your community at a small community scale to say, you know, what's the data telling us, and at what scope can we get that data, and then what does that mean for the type of problem intervention that we might take on in our community. So you can use this at all levels. I think where it does become much more challenging is if you're working at, let's say, across Canada or across the United States scale, because that scale is really large. And so what we often see in transformative change is folks might look at kind of geographic scales across Canada and then prototype their interventions in city, at a city level, or even at a smaller scale. So they might not initially take on across Canada change, but work on a scale that is manageable for them. But that's really important to have those conversations.
Okay, here's another question, this one from Shannon. How narrow does the definition of the problem have to be?
Oh, so that's really good. That's a good question, Shannon. Thank you for that. I think it's depending on the length of time that you are considering your intervention to be, that would help you define how narrow or how wide you're going to work. So if you want to see some kind of change within a 1-year period, you might have a more narrow intervention, right? And so your problem might also be more narrowly defined. If you're giving yourself 3 to 5 years, you might go wider in terms of your problem definition. But it's really, what do you think we could do within the time frame that realistically, what could we do within the time frame that we're working on? And it's really thinking about, you know, also, is the data available in the time frame in which we're working as well?
Perfect. Here's another question from Ro. They said that the simple, complicated, complex concept was also used in the community engagement webinar, and that they're connected, but sometimes that connection is ignored. So what exactly is that connection there?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because when it's the simple, complicated, and complex is actually really informs Tamarack's thinking, and I know it also informs the Ontario Trillium Foundation's thinking, because we're both trying to work at the level of community change and community transformation, both organizations. And so simple interventions could be programmatic, and it might mean that if you're only doing a simple intervention or a simple, trying to address a simple problem, you actually don't need to get too deep in your problem analysis. You still would want to do some analysis, but once you see it as a simple problem, the type of people you might engage around the problem might be single sector, right? Because it's, or they might bring that skill set and you can do it fairly easily. In a complicated problem, you might engage across a variety of different sectors, or you might bring in people with technical expertise, right? Because that's what they bring to bear. And you don't have to do that widespread engagement. You actually can be more focused in your engagement. In a complex problem, that's where you actually say, you know, whose eyes need to be on this problem? Do they come from different sectors? What knowledge, skills, and expertise can they bring to bear, not only from a problem definition perspective, but also from a broad scale engagement perspective to leverage resources to solve the problem over the longer term. So it's that kind of lens of simple, complicated, and complex can actually play a realm or play have resonance for both how you're going to engage people, but also ultimately how you want to solve a problem. So thanks for that, because it has resonance for both, I would agree.
Okay, here's a question from Beatrice. She said, can you say something about language and finding the right language for different audiences? She had an example of dealing with traffic calmness around a hospital and using language of a patient journey to connect with the hospital administration. Do you have any tips on using language for different audiences?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I had a similar conversation earlier this week around well-being and, how do we understand that and, is it shared and all of that kind of stuff. So these complex problems, we sometimes get into this more technical language, right? And so I think it is actually in some of that problem scoping conversation. One of the tools that we use a lot at Tamarack, and I know they use it for the Ontario Trillium Foundation. It's a conversational tool more than a strict kind of tool. But we ask, how do you engage with this problem that we're trying to solve? And there's an example. We were working on increasing health outcomes for children in a community in Canada. And as we were going into the problem identification conversation, some of that scoping work, that was almost the first conversation that we had. And so one person said, I'm a mother who has a child with special needs and I navigate the system this way, right? And so she was able to kind of share her expertise or her experience around that. And another person had another story. And as we went around the room, the 12 people that we had gathered into that room had different experiences around improving outcomes for children. And so that became very helpful to us in terms of understanding the language, right? And so when we start to think about, where we might land on scoping this problem, understanding it from this different frames is helpful. I think the other thing that is really helpful is to then test it, right? So you've scoped out your problem. You might have created this common agenda statement that says, okay, this is the change that we want to see using a common agenda tool, and these are kind of the strategies that we're going to put into place. Test it. Don't just go out and move it forward. Have some people in your community that are trusted allies and test it with them. Have some other people in the community who might be, we call them content experts, so people that are working in the field who can give you some feedback, but then also have some context experts, have some citizens, have some patients, and test it from their perspective. Does it make sense? Does it resonate? Is the language accessible? And that's a really important part of the work, because if you have such high level language that nobody really understands what you're doing, they're not going to be motivated to do anything about it, right? So it's really about making it concrete and real for folks. And there's lots of examples out there, like child-friendly leave, making Hamilton the best place to raise a child. There's lots of that kind of framing it as aspiration and really using, language that is accessible. That really creates the kind of draw to people to want to get involved with trying to tackle the problem.
Perfect. Thank you. Here's a question from Tony. Hours are hard to find to do these important things. How do you prioritize this while you're struggling with day-to-day needs?
Tony, that is a very good question. That's a very good question. And hours are very difficult to find. What I would do is I would think about it in a way that, could we bring a bunch of folks together and do it in a day? And what would it take for us to do this scoping and scaling? Even if we don't have a whole day, could we do it in an afternoon? So we're not doing 1 hour meetings over and over again and getting to a little bit of it. Let's try to tackle it from a big way. We won't get it 100% perfect, but if we can do a majority of this and get really prepared and be very thoughtful about the meeting, maybe have a facilitator if you're able to, have someone either donate their facilitation skills or, if you have some resources, to pay a facilitator for that. It doesn't take a long time, but you've got to be very thoughtful about the agenda for that meeting and really work your way through that meeting. In the one community that I was working with, they gathered everybody together for a day, and they came out of that day with the broad the broad problem identification and the broad strokes of their scoping and scaling. And so that was really good strategy for them. And then they took it out and tested it in the community with one-on-one meetings with others. And that doesn't have to land only on your shoulders. If you have a number of people around the table, they've been engaged in that kind of problem identification meeting, then you might say to them, how can we all maybe take this and test it with one or two people that we know, and then come back together and hear what we heard, right? So if you think about how can we share this work, it takes it off of the shoulders of just you as an individual.
Okay, here's a question from Simon. He says, in Northern Ontario, I've come across instances where community-based organizations have consulted, not engaged, their communities on the development of plans, strategies, etc. When they received feedback, it was seemingly amended or removed from the final report, and follow-up questions were greeted with silence. Do you have any advice on how to build public trust between the general public and local community-based organizations when community or communication and engagement is clearly a barrier?
Wow, that's a big question. One I kind of dealt with a little bit, and maybe we can add this in the post-event email. I wrote a paper recently about turf trust, co-creation and collaboration. And I think it is a big issue that you've raised there, because not only Stephen Covey talks about these different waves of trust, and he starts with kind of, do we trust ourselves? Do we trust the organizations in which we're working? Is there trust in the community around the organizations in which we're working? And is there societal trust that if we're going to try to tackle one of these big issues, that we actually have the wherewithal, the resources to be able to tackle it? And, we have to consider those waves of trust in this kind of work, because we might think, oh, yes, we can tackle this issue of homelessness. But if in fact the issue of homelessness in our community has been around for 50 years and nobody's been able to resolve it, and in fact it's getting worse, and then we bring together this group of stakeholders, there will be some mistrust at the very beginning around whether you actually can solve it, because you've gotten this 50-year history of not being able to solve it. And so that really says that you need the right stakeholders around your table, and that you have to build trust within your community. And so engaging people around this complex issue, doing some of this due diligence around problems identification and problem scoping, paying attention to data, looking at it from a transforming your community perspective, all of those things, doing the due diligence up front, leads to that kind of growing trust. And then as you begin the execution of this work, you actually want to look at, is there some low-hanging fruit in your community? Are there some leverage points that can get you some early wins? And then once you've achieved some of those, communicate. Let the community know that you're making progress. And that's, for those of us that are time-starved, or we have a lot of time poverty, it really, it's a bit frightening to take on this work. The way that I would suggest it is, we have to do it together, and that's the engagement piece of it. So, and if we can't engage, if everybody in the community is time starved, maybe what we have to do to build capacity is not take on such a big transformative problem, but narrow the scope of our problem in the first instance to get some traction and some success. So take on a simple problem, or maybe even a technical problem. Don't tackle complex if you don't have the right amount of resources to tackle the complex well. Figure out what the simple and technical are, do those ones first, tackle them, get some success, and then move on to complicated if you need to, or complex.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more. This one is from Mandy. Say, what if there's little measurable data to use to convince the wider community of the issue? How do you collect that data while also working on the issue and making sure people affected by the issue feel heard?
Yeah, so that often will happen in lots of our communities. I would say my experience, so here's a story I want to tell you. I was working on the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. I mentioned this in the webinar, and we were wanting to understand the issue of poverty in our community. So we went to everybody in our community and said, are you collecting data about poverty? And we got about 35 people into the room who were collecting data about poverty. And when we asked them, we did a survey before we got them into the room, there were 600 data points that they were collecting about poverty. So there may be more data than we even realize, right? So that was like almost like, oh, wow, that's way too many, because they really say that, 3 to 5 solid ones, and then maybe 10 to 15 maximum data points are what you want, particularly in a complex issue. But 600 is overwhelming. And so then we had to go through an exercise of, okay, so which of these 600 are, collected in a time frame that we need and relevant to what we're doing, et cetera. So we developed some criteria around kind of subbing our way through those 600 data points. So that's the first thing that I would suggest, is try to ask everybody, are you collecting any data around this, and what is it, and could we enter into a conversation around data? The second thing that we've been seeing in some community change efforts, particularly complex community or transformative community change efforts, is that they will have some data points, but then they'll have some that they acknowledge have to be in development, right? That they don't necessarily have them immediately. And this is, we've seen this happen a couple of times in with groups that are tackling addictions and mental health issues, right? That there's some data within hospitals and within public health units, but then there are some behavioral data points that they don't have. And so they say, okay, so we've got this amount, and we know that in the first 2 years of this intervention, we're going to work on some other data points. And I think that people are okay with that. Another example, which is a really interesting one, is a neighborhood initiative in the United States, and I can't remember the name of that neighborhood initiative, but we've talked about it before, but I'll look it up and add a link into the post-event email. But this neighborhood initiative has some large-scale data points, and then they collect things that are self-reported data points when, parents visit their doctors with their children, parents reporting that they're reading to their children, and they will collect those on almost like a monthly basis from, their group. And so they have their higher level community-wide data points, and then they have these kind of smaller level data points where they can see trending over time. So you might have a mix, right, of indicators that are population level indicators, and then they might be programmatic level indicators. The Halton Our Kids Network also does an example where they survey, so they use population level indicators to look at, whether all children in Halton region are thriving. They also use education level indicators that the school boards provide, and then they do surveys, right? But they don't do surveys every year. One year they do parent surveys, the next year they might survey the children in grade 6, and then the following year they survey the youth in grade 12. So it's interesting to see how different groups have approached how they look at data, and they have had conversations about, would this data collection be helpful to us understanding whether we're having an impact on this intervention or not.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again, Liz, for your thoughtful presentation. And many thanks to all of you for joining us. Your comments and questions really added a lot to the conversation. As promised, in a few days, we'll email you with the recording of this webinar, along with other material related to today's call. We also have some incredible learning opportunities that are just around the corner that I'd love to share with you. We're hosting our annual Collective Impact 3.0 workshop, a 3-day offering that will explore the latest in the practice of collective impact from experts, practitioners, and early adopters of the work. This workshop is about a month away, so don't hesitate to sign up for that if you are currently working on a collective impact initiative. As a reminder, special rates are available for Ontario Trillium Foundation grantees, so do reach out if you want to take advantage of that savings. We also officially launched a brand new masterclass series this week that will be led by evaluation pioneer Michael Quinn-Patton and experienced evaluator Mark Cabage, in a one-day masterclass that explores the principles-focused evaluation approach and demonstrates its relevance and application in a range of settings. These will take place in Toronto, Regina, Calgary, and Vancouver beginning March 12th, so we encourage you to follow the link on your screen if that perks your interest. Lastly, in April, we're hosting a workshop in Kitchener, Ontario, all about asset-based community development with a focus on neighborhood development and community health. This will be a rare opportunity to learn from Cormac Russell and John McKnight, two of the world's top trainers in asset-based community development. Registration links for all these events will be shared in the email you receive after today's webinar, along with links to sign up for the next installment of this Transformative Action webinar series. To learn more about upcoming learning opportunities, including workshops and free webinars like this one, visit us at www.tamarackcommunity.ca. We also encourage you to take a minute to complete a short webinar survey to offer feedback on how you enjoyed today's call. The link is on your screen and will be sent out to your email as well. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.